Today is the day we're going to start a country. Okay, now we finished the Revolutionary War, which was cool to have the Revolutionary War be done and over with. As I said, it wasn't really the Americans who won the Revolutionary War, it was the French and their allies, and then England just lost it. They lost the Revolutionary War. But it still leaves this space where, thanks to this treaty at the end of the war, America has sovereignty over its own land and also has new land to settle to the west, because they are awarded everything up to the Mississippi River. Everything north to Canada and south to Florida now belongs to those colonies. It belongs to those 13 colonies, thanks to a treaty that's going to be enforced by the French and by the Spanish. So England is not going to be able to just renege on this treaty right away. They're going to have to abide by it. They're going to have to leave people alone. So we've got some decisions to make as a country. What kind of country is it that we're going to be? So a state is a politically organized body of people under a single government. What we have at the beginning of this, what we have at the end of the Revolutionary War, are 13 states. We have 13 individual, politically organized people, politically organized bodies. We have the state of Virginia. We have the state, just like there is the state of France and the state of England. Each one of these little bodies has its own governing system. So in order to put them all together into a single country, we're going to have to make some decisions about what kind of country that's going to be. How do you, what kind of new state are we going to create here? What kind of new government are we going to create? What people are used to is a monarchy. This is where most of the inhabitants of those 13 states came from countries or descended from people who came from countries that had monarchies. A monarchy is a sovereign state that's ruled by a single person who inherited their rule through heredity, like a king or a queen or an emperor. These are monarchies. And that's what people are used to. When Thomas Paine was, to be clear, this is not to be confused with a dictator. Just because a country has a king does not mean that king is all powerful. As a matter of fact, what England has at the end of the Revolutionary War is what's called a constitutional monarchy. A monarchy in which the king has to also answer to a parliament, has to also answer to a representative government. Yeah, well, they do have duties that are just for them specifically, and one of the weird things about King George III was that he took those duties really, he tried to take power away from Parliament and take, reign, from himself, which was something that they had fought a civil war about over there in England. So he almost got kicked off the throne for that. But a constitutional monarchy is a monarchy in which there is a king who inherits his title, but there is also a body of people that are elected who get to make decisions. That's what they have in England now. They have a constitutional monarchy. So it's not to be confused with a dictator. That's not what America wants, obviously. From Thomas Paine's Common Sense, he asked the question back in 1775 when he wrote Common Sense. He asked, no, it was January 1776. He asked the question, where is the king of America? So if we're going to start a new country, where is the king? You can drink your drinks. I'm not going to tell you. I'm sorry, you look like you're struggling. Where is the king of America? I tell you, friend, he reigns above and doth not make havoc of mankind like the royal of Britain. Yet that we may not appear defective, even in earthly honors, let a day be solemnly set apart for proclaiming the charter, which is the document that governs the country, proclaiming the charter. Let it be brought forth, placed on the divine law, the word of God, and let a crown be placed on it, by which the world may know that so far as we approve of monarchy, that in America, the law is king. So this is what Thomas Paine had proposed before they decided to go to war. This is what Thomas Paine had proposed and people had clung to and decided that they liked. That in America, the law would be king. And yes, it has a ruler because God's in charge of everything, but the king of America will be the law and nothing else. So if y'all want to crown something, then go ahead and take a day and bring the law out and set it on a pedestal on top of the word of the Bible and put a crown on it, and that way you can be happy that you crowned something. But in America, the law is king. So that's not what America's going to have. So what are their other options? If they're not going to have a monarchy, one thing that they could do is have a republic. A republic is a state in which supreme power is held by the people and their elected representatives. Now, it is not a new idea. As a matter of fact, the ancient Greeks had republics. The oldest republics that we know about are ancient Greece, ancient Rome, and they did eventually also have monarchs that they raised up out of that republic, but they started off as republics. In the 1700s, even the countries that were trying not to have a king, like those small states in Germany that we were talking about, some of them have kings, but some of them don't. They're republics. The way that they do it is to gather all the richest people and have the richest people elect representatives. And so it's still kind of a monarchy because it's still the richest, most powerful people who get to be in charge. For most of the places that have republics in the 1700s, that's what they have. The differences in what kind of republic you have, it depends on what the government does with power once it's in power. So you have things like socialist republics. Later in history, you have governments that try to form and then impose socialism. Or you have religious republics, for example, Islamic republics. There are a lot of those. There are Islamic republics where the people elect caliphates from among the teachers, and then those teachers impose Islamic-based law based on that, divine Sharia law. Those are two different kinds of republics. What America wants to have is called a democratic republic. A democracy, in a democracy, citizens vote on everything. Individual citizens vote on everything. Every law, every budget item, every representative, every office that needs to be filled, every road that needs to be paved, they take a vote of the people. That's the way a democracy works. In a democratic republic, the people vote on some issues and they elect people to vote on others. So there are some issues that you're going to vote on in a democratic republic. You're going to vote on those issues directly. How many of y'all have actually been to an election at this point? Actually went and participated in one? No shame, you're young, it's okay. Okay, did you get there and you're like, okay, here's the candidate that I came here to vote for, and here's 27 other different offices I wasn't prepared for, and what the heck is this SB number 14 that I also apparently need to have an opinion on? Did you notice that there were those? Okay, the reason for that is because we're in a democratic republic. We elect officials to vote on a lot of things, and then we vote directly on things that are local sometimes, and sometimes that are state. We vote directly on some things, and we elect officials to vote for us on others. That's a democratic republic. So now that we've established that this is what America has strived to become today, let's look at what they decided at first. The first thing that they decided to try to be was a confederation. Now, a confederation is a group of states that all decide to be independently in charge of themselves, but then on a couple of issues, they'll come together and discuss it and take a vote. But for the most part, they are going to be 13 different countries. And those 13 different countries are only going to come together to vote on a couple of things. So this was what they started with. And they started this in 1776, before they'd even won the Revolutionary War. They organized under what was called the Articles of Confederation. They started in 1776. Yes. Sure. Go ahead. You got it? Okay. So in 1776, in order to make the decision to put George Washington in charge of the army, they had to come together and decide that they were going to be at least somehow connected to each other. Not 13 different states all fighting with England at the same time, but 13 different states participating in one body, which was the Confederation. They worked on the documentation for this all throughout the war. They kept working on it and tweaking it and trying to figure out a way to make it work so that if they won, so that if Britain finally did give up, they would be able to say, this is our new government. So the Articles of Confederation are made out of patchwork. They're put together out of problem solving in the middle of a war. And they ratified it, they finalized and ratified it in 1781, right after the Battle of Yorktown. Some of the things that the Articles of Confederation had. First of all, Every state has its own government and judicial system. So all the courts are separate. There's no high court above all the states. There's just courts in each state. In order to pass new legislation, 9 out of the 13 states had to agree, okay? But only 1 vote per state. So you could send between 2 and 7 delegates to meet, but then all of your delegates had to agree on how your state was going to spend its 1 vote, which means that Rhode Island got the same voting power as Virginia, okay? So that Massachusetts got the same voting power as Georgia. And this was a problem, obviously, because these are these little collection of states that are really small up here around Massachusetts Bay were always in direct opposition to these great big clunky states that were around Chesapeake Bay. And they had different ideologies, they had different ideas, they had different priorities, they had different industries, they had different economies. And if they all grouped together, then there were about 8 or 9 of them up there in Massachusetts Bay, and about 3 or 4 of them around Chesapeake Bay. So it takes 9 votes, and you get all of the little New England states to agree on something. There's nothing the South can do about it. So right off the bat, they're having trouble with us. One of the big decisions that they have to make is, what do we do with the Ohio River? Because this territory wasn't settled by any of the states, and suddenly now, at the end of, in 1781, as part of that treaty, now it belongs to the colonies. But which colony? It just belongs to the colonies in general. So who gets to decide what to do with it? Well, they do manage to come to an agreement on exactly how to deal with this, which is good because they're not really having very much luck agreeing on much else. Thomas Jefferson wrote what was called the Land Ordinance of 1785. What he did was he took all of this territory around the Ohio River Valley and he divided it into townships, which were 6 miles by 6 miles. So it was a square. It was 6 miles and 6 miles. And each one of those 1 little mile was a parcel of land that could be bought or sold. And they had to turn over 2 of them, 1 for government and 1 for school. But then the rest could be sold, okay? And if you got enough of them together, then you had a township. So just for reference, if a township is 6 miles across and 6 miles down, that's 36 square miles. So just for reference, just so you know, Texarkana is about 20 square miles. It's about 5 miles across and about 4 miles the other direction, north and south, something like that. Anyway, so this is a pretty big piece of territory that forms a township. And each one of these 1 mile sections would be bought by like a group of people who would then divide it up into farms or shops or things like that. So that was the idea. So they did solve some problems, but they were very weak because only all of them together could declare war on another country. So if France picks a fight with just Virginia, then in order to hit France back, all of the states would have to agree to do it. They can vote on a tax, but they can't enforce it. As a government, they can't enforce a tax. So what does a tax pay for? What do federal tax dollars pay for that might be important in this day and age? And roads are good, infrastructure is good, but what's the big thing that they should be most worried about? What does most of your tax money pay for? Funding of the military, that's right. They don't have any way to pay for the central military. They had a continental army to fight off Britain, and they had a continental navy to fight off Britain. And in order to maintain that, they have to charge a tax, but this government doesn't have any way to enforce a tax. They can just say they want one, and that's all they can do. So it's not a good system. So, and I had a slide for that. There's nobody in charge of foreign policy. If you're going to negotiate a trade agreement with Spain, for example, there's nobody in the central government of the Confederation whose job that is. Each individual state could negotiate one, but if you're Spain, do you really want to negotiate a different trade agreement with Virginia than you have with Massachusetts? Wouldn't you just rather trade with something more organized, like, for instance, France? Why would you negotiate with each one of these people? Also, they're going to have different money. They're going to have different economies. Everything about them is going to be different. So there's nobody to negotiate a trade agreement. So it's weak. those are no president, no executive agencies, no judiciary, no tax base, no army funding, no navy funding, no foreign policy, no trade policy. This is the Articles of Confederation. This is what happens if you take 13 individual states and they try to work together, and then the rest of the time they just govern themselves as 13 separate countries. This won't be the only time in history that this happens. Y'all are too young to remember that we used to have a huge conglomeration of independent states that were all tied together in what was called the Soviet Union. And that when it fell apart, suddenly they were, I see my geography tests were way easier than yours. Yeah. Because Europe was like these countries and the Soviet Union. Now there's like 27 new countries because of that. Right, and they all have to answer questions like who pays for our military, how do we tax our citizens, what kind of government do we have? So this isn't the only time in history that that would happen. But one of the ways that you can see that it's a problem takes place in 1786. So let's take a look at Virginia, or Massachusetts, I'm sorry, Massachusetts in 1786. John Hancock is the governor of Massachusetts. Now, John Hancock was a smuggler and a pirate, but everybody really liked him a lot. So it wasn't hard for him to be, to rise to power. All of these communities around the bay are driven by foreign trade because their industries are shipping. They build ships, they use ships to get goods across the Atlantic. But over here on this edge, it's all rural and agricultural. So rural agricultural trade goods have a completely different population than the port cities that are around the bay. European merchants insist on coins. They don't want to trade for goods, and they only want to trade for coins that are made out of something, so silver or gold. European merchants are very untrusting at this point of all of those individual states, like I said. The urban Massachusetts merchants have to have coins in order to trade out with Europe, which is their whole job is to trade with Europe. They have to have coins to do it. So what happens is that the farmers back here who depend on the merchants out here for some of the supplies that they use to farm with can't purchase with their farm goods. They can't come out and use their crops to mortgage their farms so that they can buy the equipment that they need to do the farming that they do. They have to come up with the coinage because otherwise the port city can't trade with Europe. Farmers had to mortgage their farms they had to go to banks, mortgage their farms and say, give me hard currency so that I can go to the merchants so that I can buy what I need using the currency that in other words, this is a domino problem. Because Europe doesn't trust the states, Europe wants hard coins. Because the merchants need hard coins in order to purchase what they need in order to continue their business, they have to get hard coins from the farmers. In order for the farmers to get hard coins, they have to go to the bank and take out mortgages on their farms. This is a problem that snowballs and snowballs and snowballs. And part of the issue that's making them salty here is, do you know who fought in that Revolutionary War that allowed these bay merchants to be able to establish trade as an independent body from England? Do you know who mostly did most of that fighting? The farmers, the rural population are largely veterans of the Continental Army. So they are expecting paychecks still that have never come. They are still way far behind on paying the Continental Army. So these veterans are already in the hole because they allowed themselves to be employed as Continental soldiers, even though they never received a paycheck for it. And now they have to mortgage their farms. At some point, Governor Hancock realizes that he can't fix this problem, and he does what he considers to be the most sensible thing, and that is he resigns. Okay, he's a smuggler and a pirate. This is not his department. So he resigns, and the governor that comes in and takes over for him is Governor Bowdoin. And Governor Bowdoin decides that the answer here is to institute harsher tax collection laws against the farmers. Get them either paying their taxes or seize their farms. We've got to get this all sorted out once and for all. And if that means that they end up, say again? That totally works for England. Yeah. I mean, you need to recover the costs of the businesses that lost money in the revolution. So let's tax the part of the most vulnerable part of the population, which is in this case, the farmers. So John Bowdoin is the governor, and he himself is one of those bay merchants. He's one of those guys that lives off of that industry. He recognizes that the success and the economic prosperity of Massachusetts depends on trade with Europe, and therefore that we ought to do whatever we can do to get the money flowing, even if that means farmers being homeless. So one of those homeless veteran farmers is Daniel Shays. Daniel Shays, here's a quote by him. He says, "The great men are going to get all we have, and I think it's time for us to rise up and put a stop to it and have no more courts, nor sheriffs, nor collections, nor lawyers." So basically what he did was he organized people to stop the tax collectors. He organized the residents to prevent tax collectors from doing their jobs. When the tax collectors showed up at a farm to collect taxes, he found himself surrounded and driven off by the neighbor farmers. They went to the courts in the major cities and they protested outside of the courts. They formed what were called the regulators. And they went to courts that were processing foreclosures and protested until they couldn't ever get done with the trials for the foreclosures. And then their movement spread across state lines, and other states that were having similar problems began to also form divisions of regulators, people whose job it was to stop tax collectors from collecting their taxes and show up at courts and protest whenever the courts were trying to have foreclosure proceedings. Rhode Island, for example, down here, Connecticut, they had their own regulators. They had their own little armies of protesters who took on Shays' rebellion. So at one point, Shays' men decided that if they were going to be a real movement, then they needed to do what real militia movements did. And they decided to try to seize an armory. They went to Springfield, Massachusetts to seize an armory. But the Massachusetts militia, which is, while it may be formed out of people who live here, is organized and commanded by people who live here. The Springfield militia was ready for them, and as a result, Shays' rebels had to flee. They fled across the land and they just robbed merchants for everything that they needed. They just broke into the small urban centers. They just broke into them and robbed them for everything they needed. They basically looted. And then they set up a camp outside of Sheffield, and the militia came and attacked them. So this was never going to be a successful movement, but it shows you that there's a lot of anger already between the people who are rural and the people whose eyes are turned out towards Europe, who are dealing with that. What leadership learned from Shays' rebellion is poor people cannot be trusted to choose their own representatives, because the poor people chose Daniel Shays. It's not Shays' rebellion, it's Shays' rebellion. Anyway, poor people cannot be trusted to choose their own elected representative. We must organize the power structure so that it's neater and more centralized, and it matters that we use due process. Those farmers should not have been robbed of their land without some kind of process of appeal. But that process of appeal should take place in a centralized government that has more, power and everything. It scared the governments, the state governments. So they decided it's time to scrap the articles. It's time to throw them out. In September of 1786, Hamilton and Madison and a couple of other high-ranking officials, the people responsible for drafting the Declaration of Independence and negotiating with France, decided to have a meeting, and they scheduled a convention in Philadelphia for May of 1787. They met in 1786. They invited delegates from all the states, but only 5 states showed up. They knew that was going to happen. So knowing that that was going to happen, because this was a meeting to fix the Articles of Confederation. But when only 5 states showed up, they said, oh, okay, well, instead of fixing the Articles of Confederation, let's wait a year and meet in May of 1787. And when we do, we'll draft some new documents. And they got to vote on that because they were the ones who showed up. They knew that was going to happen. They knew that nobody was going to show up. I'm involved in a lot of things where we have meetings of committees, and the ones that go the best are the ones people don't show up for, because we solve so many questions and we appoint volunteers, and then we just tell them that that's what happened because they didn't show up to represent themselves. So that's what Hamilton and Madison did. They basically held a meeting knowing nobody was going to come and made a decision that everybody else had to abide by, which is in 1787, we're going to meet and we're going to rewrite the charter for our country. We're going to do something completely new. So when they arrived in 1787, expecting to revise the Articles of Confederation, they were told by the people that had attended the one in September, oh, no, we're not going to do that. We're going to write some new documents. So within one day, they started over from scratch. So they had several different people propose plans for how to deal with this situation, how to bring the 13 states under a centralized government. One of them was the Virginia Plan. And this was proposed by James Madison, who was from Virginia. So that's why it's called the Virginia Plan, I assume. Basically, under the Virginia Plan, you would have two branches of government, all represented by the population. One branch would be elected by the people, and the other one would be elected by the House legislators for each state. So the people would elect some representatives, and the legislatures of each state would represent others. So if you're a resident of Rhode Island, that means that you're going to elect directly people from one of the branches, and then you're going to elect people in your state whose job it is to elect the other branch. Okay, so you've got some representation if you're allowed to vote at all. In some states, you wouldn't be allowed to vote unless you're a landowner. The lower house is elected by the people, and the upper house is elected by the state legislatures. And then the legislators would get together and pick who the executive was. So the legislator gets to pick the president. The people don't, under the Virginia Plan. He also introduced the idea of checks and balances, that some of the decisions that were made in one branch would be checked by the other branches. He was the one that first proposed that. So there's some aspects of this that are still with us, that are still in the Virginia Plan. And there are some aspects that aren't. One of the other plans that was proposed was the New Jersey Plan. So you have a plan proposed by the Chesapeake Bay people. Now here's a plan that was proposed by the Massachusetts Bay people. First of all, the New Jersey Plan took the Articles of Confederation and left them where they were. We like them, they're good, we'll keep those. But let's go ahead and give the federal government the power to have taxes. Let's fix the things that the articles aren't very good at. And then we'll make one vote per state. We'll keep that part because we like that part up here in Massachusetts Bay. And then we'll have a committee of people to be the president. Not just a president, but a small committee of people whose job it is to president over us, okay? That will be the executive branch. And those people will be elected by the legislature, okay? That's the New Jersey Plan. One of the downsides of the New Jersey Plan is it had a very weak judiciary branch because the legislature would appoint the presidents would appoint the judges, and the judges would only have power over like 3 things. So most of the laws would be prosecuted by the states. So it was very weak. But they actually thought that was a good thing. They thought that states should have more power in the government than deciding people's individual fate than the federal government. So the Connecticut Compromise took the Virginia Plan and took parts of it that they liked, and took the New Jersey Plan and parts of it that they liked, and put them together. And I know you can't read this very well because the typing is so small. So you'll have to look at, you can look at it later after I post it. But ultimately in the, well, I should mention there was one other plan proposed, and that was Hamilton's plan. Hamilton proposed his own plan for government, a completely separate thing from either Virginia or New Jersey. He proposed that we should get rid of the states. There should be no more states. Everything should just be one state, the state of America. That should be it. He proposed that the lower house be elected by the people, but the upper house be elected by electors, and that all of the governors of each of these states would become the new president, the committee of the president. So there would just be a committee for a president, and that committee would be made out of the governors of all the states. And then there would be no more states after that. So he wanted to dissolve the states into something new. He had his whole own idea. They basically took his plan and went, no. Okay. So what we end up with is called the Great Compromise. And this is all the argumentative bodies from the Chesapeake Bay and the Massachusetts Bay get together and talk about what they like and what they don't like. And what they decide to have is that each state will have 2 representatives, and those will be the Senate. And that's what we have now. 2 representatives from each state are in the Senate, and they work independently from each other. They don't have to talk to each other at all. They don't have to like each other. They don't have to vote the same way. They're in the Senate. And then the other house will be the House of Representatives, and that will be based on the population. So states that have more people in them will have more representatives in the House. And the House is going to be responsible for spending the money. So the people will get a direct voice in how their money is spent, because they will have more representatives if they live in, more populated states. And then an electoral college will elect the president. And that electoral college will be comprised of, each state would have a number of electors based on their population. Each state gets to make their own laws about how those electors get chosen. And the electoral college gets to decide who the president is going to be. So that's no longer a popular vote. We don't have to worry about this whole thing where poor people aren't good at choosing their own representatives. Because look, they chose Daniel Shays to lead them. So poor people aren't good at that. That's what we have now. Now, how do y'all think that's working out, just out of curiosity? You think it's working pretty well? It's complicated. It's incredibly complicated. But it starts with the idea that people as a group aren't good at making decisions for themselves. So they need help. But people still need to be represented. There still needs to be representation. The question is, what do you count as people? Now, at the time, if you counted all of the people who were free people who lived on their own power and were, people, then by population, an argument could be made that Massachusetts had more people than Virginia. Okay, but if you counted slaves who were there against their will, who were there whether they wanted to be or not, and had no vote and had no voice, but you counted them as part of the population, then Virginia had more people. And depending on who has more people, so Virginia is actually fighting for slaves to be counted in the population, even though they can't vote, so that they can have more representatives. And the North is saying, no, only free people should be counted in the population, because what you've got are not people, they're assets, which you can buy and sell, and that's not fair to the rest of us. This almost breaks down all of the negotiations, this whole question, because it makes the difference between who has more representatives, the South or the North. It makes more difference. Before we go any further, I want to be clear. Slavery is a part of all 13 states. There is no state in which slavery is not feeding the economy. Everybody is benefiting from the business of slavery, from the North to the South. That's not the problem. The problem is the pure sheer number of heartbeats that each one of those represents, and how that affects their representation in college, in the House of Representatives. So the compromise they come up with is called the 3/5 compromise. Yes?
Would you say that slavery in the Revolutionary War, or in that time period, was less harsh than it was in, say, the Civil War era?
In America specifically?
Yes.
I would say that there are differences in the way that slaves are treated between one and the other. In North American Southern colonies, slaves have more freedom of movement during the Revolutionary War era than they do during the Civil War. That has a lot to do with what happens in Haiti in the next 20 years that we haven't gotten to yet. In Haiti, they have a revolution, a slave rebellion, and so the South clamps down on the movement of slaves so that they're not as able to move freely or meet freely. Their lives are very different. So, but the conditions not being as harsh, no, I wouldn't agree to that. They definitely, well, no, because with the cotton gin, they do get harsher.
That's what I was thinking.
Yeah, with the cotton gin, they get harsher and more populous. There are more slaves than ever after the cotton gin. So, yeah, I would say slavery during this time is not good, but it's not as bad as it's going to get. That being said, this is the beginning of the Middle Passage. And that, I mean, if there's the Middle Passage is still alive and active at this time, and it's in the next 20 years that that's going to be cut down, that the Middle Passage for retrieving slaves and bringing them over, in which there's a huge fatality rate and vast mistreatment, is actually going to end before the Civil War. So it depends on which part of a slave's life you're talking about, I guess. In the 3/5 compromise, does anybody know what that is?
It's like 3/5 of the people vote. If there's more than 3/5, then it happens.
It's a nice idea, but no.
It's the landowner slaves count for 3/5 of a person.
That's right. In the 3/5 compromise, which makes it so that the North, that the Chesapeake states and the Massachusetts Bay states can agree. They agree that that a slave counts as 3/5 of a person. So in order to have 3 people, you need 5 slaves. That balances out the population a little bit so that it's not so much power going to the southern states, but it's not taking away all of their population representation either. So that's the reason they agree to it. So a person, and this isn't just slaves, this is people who are African at all. So this also counts for freedmen. A freed black person is also worth 3/5 of a person, a little bit more than half. The other thing that they agree on in the Constitution is that there will be no provision for outlawing slavery in the Constitution. The South absolutely insists that this is not the document that's going to do that. The Constitution is not going to end slavery, but they do agree that within 20 years they will end international slave trade. So you'll have to have the slaves you have, and those will be the ones you have. Them and their children will be who you have. Well, that's really going to happen, is that there's just going to be an uptick in the smuggling of slaves, but that's beside the point. As a matter of fact, in the Constitution, there is a Fugitive Slave Act written into it specifically for this reason. It's constitutionally protected to return slaves that have run away from one state to another. So that's the document that they negotiate and they come up with. It's called the Constitution of the United States. And it takes a little bit of time for everybody to agree to it. But once they do, all 13 states do eventually ratify it. I think the last state to ratify it is Georgia. The last state to ratify it is Georgia, and even then, some of Georgia doesn't quite agree. Georgia in elections has always historically had a lot of fun. One of the things that they decide pretty much right away, as soon as it's ratified in 1788, is to start meeting as an electoral college and select a president. 100% of the electoral college votes for the same person. And that person is George Washington. He's an easy pick. So what we end up with at the end of this is a president who is universally chosen, but who is not a king. But that's tricky because he was universally chosen, and he has the ability to shape what happens next in the executive branch of the government. He has the ability to decide what that's going to look like from here on out. We don't have parties, we don't have political parties, but we do have groups that are forming alliances right from the beginning. We have people who have the interests of the Chesapeake in mind, and the cash crop colonies, tobacco colonies, indigo colonies, and we're starting to have cotton too, but that hasn't quite gotten off the ground yet. And then we've got the places that are focused on shipping, building boats, lumber, trading goods that Europe wants. So we've got an entire group of people who's focused on the West because cash crop colonies have to gain land in order to thrive. So they're pointing towards the West, and an entire group of people who are pointed towards Europe in the East, and whose interests are going like this. And so we don't have political parties yet, but we do have people who have divergent interests right from the beginning. Okay, so we covered a lot of ground today. I want to give you a chance to go back and get any of it that you missed, because we're going to talk about this more on Wednesday, about things right off the bat. Yes?
Was LaGuardia, Maine, was that just part of Massachusetts at that time?
Yes. Yeah, well, Maine is established as its own colony. You know what? Yeah, as part of a compromise with something else, in order to add a slave state, they add a free state, so they make Maine its own state. We haven't quite gotten to that yet, but yeah, Maine is just it's just part of Massachusetts at this point. But it's divided in the middle by New Hampshire. So,
Yeah.
Anybody else? Okay, so on Wednesday, we're going to take a look at the earliest documents and how they get, and then we're going to talk about some of the struggles they had. So I've given you a document to take a look at, which should be one of the easier ones I've ever given you, I think. Let me see. It's just the Bill of Rights, yes. Which I'm sure y'all know a lot about, because y'all know about your rights, don't you?
I now have the School of Rock songs stuck in my head.
Not my fault. Okay, so between now and Wednesday, do me a favor and take a look. And just familiarize yourself with the Bill of Rights. A lot of times I'll give you an extra point quiz, but I probably won't do that in this class, just because that's complicated. But under the bold experiment, take a look at the Bill of Rights, which you should be able to see. And then on Wednesday, I'll open up the Bill of Rights assignment. Okay, the Bill of Rights is the first 10 amendments to the Constitution. So there are a bunch of amendments to the Constitution now. There are lots of amendments, but these are the first 10. And these are probably the ones that affect your life the most directly, with a couple of exceptions later on. So take a look at those, and yeah, I'll see you on Wednesday.
Oh, what are we doing? What are we doing Friday?
What are we doing Friday?
I won't be here Friday, but I'll be on Zoom.
Okay.
Yeah. Me too.
I promise we won't have like a game of charades or anything that you'll miss.
No, it's funny. I'm having to learn all this. I will also.
Oh, good. Have you ever taken one of those?
I haven't taken my 5.
Yeah. How'd you do?
I tried. Mine was easy. I just had